All right, tonight we're going to be talking about government and the economy. The last unit that we studied was the private sector. In other words, you need a job, therefore you do certain things in order to make sure you can survive. This is a civics class, so we talk a lot about how the government interacts with everything. And so we have to understand that the government plays a huge role in our economy. The first thing to understand is that we, again, are a free market capitalistic society, which means we want a very small government. The idea that government has to have a limited role. You cannot have freedom without, if you guys want to take the test at home, or take the test out there, go ahead. Is this distracting for you? By the way, for those of you watching at home right now, I'm making fun of Vanessa and Skoog because they're in here taking a test. They're staring at me like a bunch of creepers right now. It's awkward. All right, so the government has to be small. That's what we see. That doesn't mean that they have no role. It means that they have to have relatively small footprint as far as what they're going to do. Their goals are first to maintain the legal system. The idea that we need to make sure that I can trust the law. If somebody does something that violates the law, I have to trust that our government will take care of that. Specifically, the law of a contract. If I sell a car to someone and they sign a contract promising to pay me $200 every month for the next 5 years, I have to feel confident that the law will force them to do that. Second, private property. If I buy a car, I have to feel safe that I will be able to keep that car. In other words, nobody can just wander in and take my stuff. This is an extension of the legal system, but in many countries they don't believe in private property. This is one of the problems the Native Americans had back in history when we talk about us buying land from them. They really didn't understand the concept of owning land. That wasn't part of their culture. And the third, watch them jiggle, there it is they have to maintain competition. We want competition. The reason the iPhone is good is because they want you to buy an iPhone, not a Nokia, not a Motorola, not a BlackBerry. I'm going to do that one more time just so you watch the jiggle. There it goes. And they jiggle out. The U.S. is not a pure free market system. We do not have in the entire world a pure free market system because a pure free market system would be very, very similar to anarchy. And if you remember back to our discussion on philosophers, it is very, very close to anarchy where we run into problems. So, we say that our government is allowed to regulate, has to regulate. In other words, they pass laws to protect us. And we'll get into more details on this later, but the idea is the government has to protect us. Number two, they have to provide public goods. Sometimes the market doesn't provide, in other words, the fact that people buy and sell stuff doesn't provide things we need because there's no profit in them. There's no profit in making water clean. There really isn't. There's no profit in cleaning air pollution. There's no profit in building roads, but we need these things. Third, we're seeing an increase in government ownership of vital businesses. And this is where we get into problems because how do you define vital? But regardless, what we see is that the government is starting to own more and more businesses. What I want to do then is break down each of these different areas. You can just set those on the table there. Number one, we want competition because monopolies are bad. If you think about the game of Monopoly, your goal is to own everything. That way other people have to pay you and you can jack up rent. So what we see is a monopoly is the only provider of any good or service. You can see the inherent problems with that. If you have to go to Apple to buy a phone, well, then they have to raise the price. Or not have to, they can raise the price because you'll pay it. There's less innovation. Companies like Microsoft were notorious for buying up competition and stifling innovation. Innovation is expensive. It's expensive to make improvements to a product because you have to pay people to figure it out, you have to design it, you have to change it. So a monopoly doesn't bother with that because the only reason you innovate is to get people to buy more of your product. There's higher prices because you don't have to compete. Coke and Pepsi compete with each other. Their prices are going to be basically the same. If one went out of business, the price of the other could go way up. Sometimes, though, there's natural monopolies. Sometimes it makes sense. I don't want competition. For example, it doesn't make sense for me to have a bunch of utilities. I don't want 15 pipes going to my house so I can choose which water is in my toilet. I simply want the cheapest, cleanest water I can get. And we think about the cost of providing water to people. It's very, very labor intensive, very, very infrastructure intensive, so it's expensive. I don't want a bunch of power lines going to my house so I can choose which electricity I'm buying. To me, electricity is the same. All I care about is the price and the reliability. So it doesn't make sense to have 20 different power lines to my house so I can choose which company to buy from. Usually what will happen then is a government either owns those, in the case of water companies, or highly regulates them. In other words, makes lots of rules and pays a lot of attention to them. Well, regulation then. What is the purpose? What is the function? It's really the government just passing laws and overseeing or watching what the government does, or what companies do, trying to make sure that companies follow rules. If you look back, it's really meant to protect the public's interests. In other words, if a company's goal is to make profit, there's a real big incentive for companies to cut corners on safety and quality if they don't have to in order to drive up profit, because making sure products are safe tends to cost more money. There was a big scare with peanut butter a couple of years ago where the peanuts had salmonella, and the company that was distributing the peanuts actually knew about it. And that's an area where regulation, in a sense, failed because a bunch of people got sick and some people actually died from it. We don't want peanut butter that hasn't been tested. We don't want companies that are allowed to make stuff without us knowing what goes into it. Again, if you want to be disgusted, look up how Chicken McNuggets are made. We want fair and honest advertising. I love these things. These are the sauna belts. Every couple of years, you'll see these late at night if you're up at 3 in the morning because you can't sleep because your kid's crying. That was 2 years ago. What you see is products that you put this belt on and it zaps you and you burn fat. You just pay 3 easy payments of $14.99 and you'll lose weight instantly. Well, let's be honest. This doesn't happen. So they keep popping up and disappearing under different names. Regulation also is meant to deal with externalities. We'll talk about externalities here in a second. Think about the root of the word external. That's really something that's outside. So what are externalities? They're the side effect of an action. In other words, when I do something, is there a cost to society? Is there something that happens because of it? For example, I open up an airport, there's noise. That's an externality. The people who are flying on the plane don't deal with the noise because they're on it. The people who live where the airport is have to deal with this negative side effect. It affects people or business outside of the business or government. It affects the people not involved in the transaction. The airport and the person buying the ticket are the market. The people living where the airport is are the people dealing with the externality, the noise pollution. Some of them are positive. The Mall of America opens and we have a positive externality. What is it? Well, increased business and traffic. And because of the Mall of America, we have things like the Water Park of America. Without the Mall of America to drive tourists, we wouldn't have enough demand for an indoor water park in Bloomington. Some of them are negative. For example, when I lived in Eagan, one of the biggest pains in the butt was traffic. So because of the Mall of America, at certain times, you have huge traffic on certain roads. Well, the people going to the Mall of America don't pay for those externalities. So sometimes government steps in to deal with it. Easy examples, pollution, whether it's noise or just literally thinking about things like smog, smoke, acid rain, those kind of things. And then just congestion, how many people are in a certain space. Well, there are 2 types of goods we've talked about before, but now we're going to categorize them in another way. We have first private goods and services, and these are things that are owned by a single individual. In other words, I can own something. It's a private good. This relies on the exclusion principle. In other words, can I make people pay to consume the good or service? If I, in my backyard, put up a hockey rink, I could charge kids in the neighborhood to come in. That doesn't mean they'll come, but because it's on private property, I can charge them to come in. It's easy to charge for because I have a fence going around my property to keep people like you who are listening to me out because I don't want you in my yard. So it's easy to charge. Examples? Anything bought at a store. If I go to a store and I buy chicken, nobody else can have that chicken. So it's easy to charge for it. Shared consumption is another example of something that should be a private good or service. In other words, what we're doing is saying, should something be a private good made by a private company, or should it be a public good made by the government? Shared consumption is the second thing we talk about for whether something should be a private good. In other words, consuming by one individual doesn't reduce value to others. If it is shared consumption, maybe it needs to be a public good. If I go to McDonald's and I order a cheeseburger, no one else on earth can share that cheeseburger. Now, you could sit here and say, well, if you cut it in half, we're sharing it. In layman's terms, yes, but in economic terms, no. Because now what happens is I only have half a cheeseburger. There is no way for me to consume a cheeseburger and give it to you. Unless you go with the baby bird theory where I chew it, I eat it, I vomit it back into you. But let's be honest, it's disgusting first. Second of all, as soon as I get rid of it, as soon as the mother bird gives the food to the baby bird, the mother bird doesn't have the food anymore. You cannot share the consumption. Public goods and services, on the other hand, are owned by the public. And the government really doesn't own them. They are the caretakers of them. They function under the non-exclusion principle. In other words, people do not need to pay to consume the good or service. Think about public parks. How would you possibly keep people out of public parks? Even if you fenced it in, who's there watching it to make sure somebody doesn't sneak in? And do we really want to do that? So since the bike paths in Hastings can be used by anyone at any point, it's awful hard for a company to charge. If they set up toll booths, people will just go to places where there aren't the toll booths and use that part of it. So the government provides that. In other words, they're very difficult to charge for. Here is the big key point on this. The idea is that the private sector, in other words, companies, will not provide these goods or services we think we want because it's hard to charge for them. How would you charge someone to use an outdoor park? How would you prevent somebody from using it without paying? Well, it's difficult, but we want public parks for kids, for safety, for things for people to do. So the government provides them through taxpayers. Examples: roads, parks, libraries, etc. These are always paid for by taxes. Here we go. Have a good night.